10 died quickly when this new apartment house collapsed and crushed them. That was a few minutes before 4 o'clock Wednesday morning. It may be days before some of the bodies are recovered, including that of the bride in this shattered wedding photo. President Luis Echeverria has called it the worst earthquake in terms of human loss in Mexico's history. Beneath the apartment building was a new car agency. The sight of some of the cars partially visible under the rubble gives some idea of the crushing force that killed those caught in the earthquake's devastation here. So massive was the destruction that by week's end it seemed as if nobody quite knew where to begin. Some passing through the town square would stand as if in awe for a moment or two as they surveyed the damage just across the street. Orizaba's main cathedral and adjoining hospital were destroyed for all practical purposes. A belfry of the church was jolted precariously askew, and there are fears it could topple at any time. As in so many Mexican towns, the church in the town square has been a focal point for over a century. It will have to come down, so will the hospital. A few blocks away, a new technical school built only 3 years ago will have to be rebuilt. These are just a few examples of the recovery that lies ahead. Homes, hundreds of them, were laid to ruin. Nowhere, perhaps, could that be more graphically seen than in the small town of Rio Blanco, a few miles from Orizaba. It hasn't all been sorted out yet, but many of the nearly 200 victims in the general area around Orizaba, in the state of Veracruz, were from here. These were houses built of cheap materials and poorly constructed for people who could not afford better. They were the worst hit.
The quake comes during the worst rainy season Mexico has experienced in 30 years. The result is devastating, with hundreds dead, thousands homeless. A band of Arab guerrillas shoots up a lounge at Leonardo da Vinci Airport in Rome. Then they throw incendiary grenades into a Pan Am airliner before taking several hostages and hijacking a plane. The scene in Rome, extreme chaos.
The plane was set on fire at both ends. Eyewitnesses said that the terrorists threw one incendiary bomb into the pilot's cabin and another into the main passenger section. A 10-foot hole was ripped in the roof of the plane, and later reports said it had been completely destroyed. Most of the passengers who were killed were said to have been in the first-class section. Eyewitnesses spoke of panic as hundreds of passengers in other planes on the tarmac tried to get away from the flames. The Pan American Boeing had just taken on a full load of fuel and was parked only about 250 yards from storage tanks.
The guerrillas eventually wind up in Kuwait, where they agree to free the hostages in return for safe passage from the country. The trail of terror ends, but 33 persons died during the terrorist attack and skyjacking.
The Vietnam War may have ended in 1973, but the Middle East, certainly no stranger to war, once again erupts in land and air battles. In October, Egypt and Syria attack Israel. Battles soon rage across the Golan Heights. Tensions had been building for several months, fanned by one incident in which Israeli planes shot down a Libyan airliner over Israeli territory, killing 70 persons. After a few days, it's obvious that this will not be another one of those six-day wars. The Arabs fight well with their Soviet weapons, and they break through Israel's Bar-Lev line on the east bank of the Suez Canal. Both sides suffer heavy losses in both men and equipment. The U.S. begins to resupply Israel, and the Soviet Union begins replacement of Arab equipment. Israeli forces cross the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, the United Nations votes in favor of a ceasefire agreement, and it seems to be taking hold. But Israel traps Egypt's Third Army on the West Bank, and the fighting continues. The Sinai Front is engulfed in battle. The Soviet Union calls on the United States to join the Soviets in a joint peacekeeping effort in the Mideast. The Soviets then threaten unilateral action after the United States refuses. The result? Tension between the superpowers not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Meanwhile, Israel begins putting on the pressure with their attacks on Syria, striking at costly targets.
The Homs refinery was a prime target for Israel's planes because the 1,000 or so tanks left here are dependent on diesel. Without fuel, the war, on this front at least, could be over quickly. The refinery was also bombed because it's a terminal point for the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which starts in Iraq, the third Arab nation to go to war against Israel this week. By the time the bombs fell, many of the 450 workers had been warned by the air raid siren, but some were trapped in the rubble.
President Nixon, who had placed military units on worldwide alert, meets with troubleshooter Henry Kissinger to discuss the tense situation. It was quite a year for Kissinger, having signed the Vietnam Peace Agreement, becoming Secretary of State, and in the case of the Mideast, playing a key role in the establishment of a ceasefire agreement. Leaders of the Israeli and Arab war machines finally meet on the field of battle, not to fight but to shake hands. A ceasefire goes into effect. The year ends with progress toward a lasting settlement in the Mideast, and with the U.S. and other countries hoping the Arab states reopen oil supplies shut off to pro-Israeli countries during that war.
David Ben-Gurion, a tough little man who forged Israel from a struggling Jewish settlement into a proud modern state, dies at the age of 87. Mr. Ben-Gurion was Israel's first prime minister and served in that post twice. His name meant son of a lion cub, a name he chose when he arrived in Palestine as a Polish immigrant.
Another leader dies, President Salvador Allende of Chile. He dies during the overthrow of his government by a military junta. It was a turbulent last few months in office for the 65-year-old Marxist president. Allende catered to the workers, but his nationalization of the economy helped split Chile into camps of hatred with no middle ground. The end comes as Chile's armed forces bombard Allende's palace from the air and from the ground. Witnesses claim Allende killed himself. Allende's widow says he was murdered. The overthrow leaves only 4 non-military governments in South America. The burial of a former United States president. 1972 ended with the death of Harry Truman. This year begins with the death of Lyndon Johnson. The burial takes place on Mr. Johnson's ranch in Texas.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lily, Christ was born across the sea with the glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me as he died to make men holy.